Hi, my name is Natalie Vasquez, and this is my presentation on critical incident technique. In order to understand what the method is, we first have to understand what a critical incident is. And it's any performance behavior that is outstanding or unacceptable. One example could be 95% of a high school algebra class has an A, and a negative example could be half of a Spanish class is failing. So the method involves an experienced subject matter expert to recall or record this information about the employee or the job. In the previous examples, we talked about classroom performance through their grades. A principal or another instructor could do a performance evaluation on a teacher and use the success of the classroom to do the appraisal. There are several purposes of the critical incident. I previously mentioned performance appraisals. That's probably the most common use of the critical incident, but they can also be used for selection, training, leadership, and criterion development for tests or questionnaires. The nature of the critical incident is very informative, and learning about employees' performances and behaviors, especially the great ones and the worst ones, can be used as realistic examples through all of these purposes. So there are strengths of the critical incident technique, and the first being they can be valid and reliable sources of information if the critical incident is good descriptive quality. The second strength of it could be is that it's useful for future reference and record keeping. The performances tell a lot about the job and its employees, so analysts or HR can go back and look at the critical incidents and make references on them. So the weaknesses of this technique is that the quality of critical incidents aren't always up to par. It's hard to get employees or supervisors, whoever is completing the critical incident, to give the best description of what happened. So it can be deficient in details and information. So there are three parts of a critical incident. The first being a statement of the context, and this is what happens leading up to the performance behavior. And then the second part is the employee behavior itself, or the action of the employee that is being understood. Last is the consequences of the behavior, whether it was positive or negative, will produce the consequence. So I'm going to give you two examples of a critical incident, and this first one is a poorly written one. And what I've made up is, after the break, the nurse returned and did not fully check the patient's vitals. The paperwork on the patients for the doctors were not finished. This employee may face negative consequences from the incomplete records. So this example does have all three parts of a critical incident, but it's not very specific. There's a lot of information lacking, and there's a lot of questions that could be asked from this description. What time of day was it? What was missing from the patient's reports? How does this affect other employees and the doctors that are working on these patients? And what kind of negative consequences, or we could learn more about of the consequences from the incomplete records. So the same situation can be written differently. It could be better written. After returning from lunch, the nurse was assigned 3 patients. as instructed. She was to report their heart rate, blood pressure, temperature, weight, and the symptoms that the patients were experiencing. All of the reports were lacking different information. Each report needs to be filled out properly so the doctors and nurses working on the patients can understand how they entered the hospital and their conditions. There will be negative consequences of this employee, and it will be decided upon through the head nurse. So this critical incident has all three parts, but there's a lot more answered questions and a lot more description, like what time of the day it was and exactly what was expected of the nurse and why her performance wasn't satisfactory, and how this affects the others around her and working with her, and how this will be played out and her consequences. So there are issues and concerns with this technique, and they're not necessarily negative, but it's things that when using the technique, individuals should be aware of. First is that the different sources, the people who are completing the critical incidences, may provide different perspectives on the employee's behaviors. Whether it's their supervisor or another analyst or a client working with the employee, they're all going to have a different experience with the worker, and one might give a good performance and another one might say their performance was lacking. So these can be used during performance evaluations to get a well-rounded view of the employee. The second is giving the sources categories to place behaviors tend to produce more incidents. And this means that if you were to give the supervisor completing the critical incident different dimensions to place the behaviors under, it's more likely that they will give more information. So if I were to be a customer service representative and my supervisor needed to collect data of a critical incident, it would be best if they were asked, how good my customer service is, my efficiency, my timeliness, things like that, that will help whoever's completing the information. Last is complex and simple forms do not differ in results. So whether you're asking the person who's completing the critical incident, whether it's a very long form or it's complicated or it's simple, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't produce better results. One doesn't solicit more information than the other. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching, and here are my references.